Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. This webinar in particular is a part of our presentation series focused on COVID-19 related community response and recovery. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Matt Kreis, who serves as General Counsel here at Community Progress. In this position, Matt has helped cities and communities across the country assess, reform, develop, and implement systems and policies to more equitably, efficiently, and effectively address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. Prior to joining the Center for Community Progress, Matt spent more than 9 years as an attorney at the City of Chicago's Department of Law, where he focused on identifying, developing, and implementing effective enforcement tools to address problem properties. Before turning it over to Matt, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all panelists. We will share both a video recording and the slide deck from today's presentation in the following weeks. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. Finally, Community Progress has created a COVID-19 resource center, which can be accessed on our website and provides resources and weekly updates for neighborhoods looking to prevent vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration related to current economic and health challenges. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Thank you so much, Justin, and welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. My name is Matt Kreis, and I've been lucky enough to spend my entire career, for the most part, either working in or working with local government. I've been privileged to work with an incredible array of local government, nonprofit, and resident partners who choose to spend their time, at least in part, focusing on how the enforcement of housing and building codes plays an essential role in an equitable, comprehensive neighborhood revitalization strategy. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to join us. Before I dive into the content, I do want to be clear that we here at Community Progress, we're very much aware that this presentation is happening at a time when many local governments are focused almost entirely on addressing the pandemic head on, keeping people in their homes, providing essential services, and supporting first responders. Many remain at home, and some are doing so without pay. Local government budgets are facing staggering shortfalls and a total lack of certainty as to where, how, or if any support will be coming from the federal government, state leaders, or other avenues. And so while we believe the expertise and skills embedded in code enforcement offices around the country will absolutely be critical and necessary, we're also keenly aware that what you need now, more than anything else, is money. There's a need for a lot of it and a need for it yesterday. So we will continue to monitor and support efforts to stimulate local economies, to fill local government budget shortfalls in the best way that we can. I do recommend checking out my colleague Rob Finn's webinar from May 7th on the federal policy response to COVID for more, if you want to talk a little bit about that. In the meantime, and for those of us privileged enough to be working either from home or in a safe office environment, now is a critical time to begin making the case for what will be needed most as we seek to move forward. As you have probably heard on every single webinar and phone call you're a part of, we don't know exactly what we're going to see yet. And for that reason, perhaps we haven't even dreamt up or identified the best and most useful tools to address what we're going to see in the coming months. That said, we aren't starting from scratch either. It's my hope that this webinar will reinforce the importance of some of those key tactics and approaches that we at Community Progress have advocated for the last 10 years. Since the Great Recession, and that it can be used as something, this webinar can be used as something of a code enforcement policy roadmap for practitioners to consider as they plan out priorities and needs in the coming months. So we're going to start with an overview of strategic code enforcement and its importance in today's world. After we do the overview, we'll talk through how code enforcement is going to be critical in the coming months and how things might need to change to have a greater impact in our communities. And then we'll spend some time focused on what kinds of existing approaches might be useful to consider as we explore next. We here at Community Progress and as part of our own internal COVID-19 code enforcement working group think that some of the key issues code enforcement will need to deal with are increased deferred maintenance, particularly for occupied properties, defining a role to address the impact of the crisis on our rental housing, and the need to be prepared to address the potential increase in vacancy and abandonment down the road. So let's start with an overview of strategic enforcement. No matter what the individual community needs might be, and they will be different everywhere, we can all agree that given limited resources that may need to be available, we have to deploy them in the most efficient and strategic way possible. To do that, we're going to need to use data and community outreach to define and prioritize the problems we're trying to solve. We need to understand where our work fits into the greater ecosystem of neighborhood stabilization and equitable community development. And we need to identify the partnerships we need to build to connect our work to theirs. This will allow us to make decisions about where our limited resources can be directed to have the most equitable and sustained impact. This is what we mean when we use the word strategic. So first, let's kind of understand what we mean when we're talking about code enforcement here today. There are lots of types of code enforcement around the country. There's different ways that it's used by different offices, but our focus here today is on housing and building code enforcement. And I want to stress that it isn't just inspectors. Code enforcement cannot accomplish all that's expected of without staffing and expertise at all levels of the system. From support staff to inspectors to officials in the field who work with owners to come to some kind of resolution, to attorneys who work with owners to come to some kind of resolution, to the administrative or municipal court hearing officers. It takes a whole host of people to get through this. It's also really important to understand before we dive into it, what are we trying to accomplish, right? If the goal is truly compliance, right? If that is our main goal, we want people to comply with it. And by extension, we would create better, safer, healthier neighborhoods of opportunity. Then we have to always be asking ourselves, are we achieving what we set out to do? Now, the most efficient way of achieving this compliance is generally to get the owner to do it. Being strategic, as we talk about first, is first and foremost about how do we maximize our efforts to support compliance so that the government doesn't have to be involved. And while this next point is true on any day, a pandemic or not, in a world where COVID-19 is around, compliance is elevated to an entirely new level. We're asking folks to stay in their homes, and we're asking them to do it for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the health and safety and ability to comply with local codes is more important than ever. So what's the goal, right? We stress often in our work the most effective tools for strategic enforcement use some combination of carrots and sticks and result in that voluntary compliance. It remains true today, but the balance may need to change. We still want the owner to go from, I'm going to ignore you, to how much time do I have to comply? But we also want to be understanding that given some of the economic impacts we're going to see, that little question, but I could really use a little help, is going to be really important going forward. Now, throughout this presentation and throughout our work, we often preach 3 components of code enforcement. And in fact, we preach this across multiple levels of what we do. But I want to define these terms so that when I use them, you understand what we're talking about. First, equitable. Equity in the law requires the recognition that different types of property owners and neighborhoods may require different approaches. It also requires, or equity also requires, that the voices of those most impacted must be incorporated in the creation of policies designed to address these conditions. We have to recognize the historical segregation of housing and resources that still guides development and the allocation of resources today. So that's what we mean when we say equitable. When we say efficient, we're trying to achieve voluntary compliance in the shortest amount of time possible. And when efficient enforcement often involves liability imposed on the property, we call that in rem, not the owner. And that's important for a number of reasons, including because it impacts how the law requires us to give notice, and because our goal at the end of the day is compliance or productive use. It isn't punishment. And finally, we talk about code enforcement as effective. And this simply means that enforcement strategies are going to be tailored based on the likelihood of compliance. And that we'll talk about a lot more as more. We talk about these principles a lot in our work. I also urge you to check out a report we did for the city of Mobile, Alabama, and I have listed that as a resource at the end of this presentation. So what do we want to do? We want to start with proactive, data-driven intervention. We want to collect data, parcel level data, social data, and market data. Parcel and social data in particular are going to be needed to assess decline and to track and monitor where it will be seen and to get input from our partners on the ground about what they're seeing. We want to know, are people paying their taxes? Are there more nuisance or police calls? Are utilities being shut off? We want to be able to track what's happening now and see how it trends in the future. We want to involve the community and gather information from them and where to keep an eye out for decline. Market data is absolutely critical because it's going to help us understand how an owner may respond to various types of enforcement. It may be tough to assess trends given limited market activity in some areas at this point, but as we mentioned before, this may also be an excellent time for code enforcement to take time to work closely with data partners to support tracking, do it in partnership with the community, and maybe to set baselines now and track trends from here to see how COVID is impacting our neighborhoods. We often show a map indicating neighborhood markets here, right, and the importance of tailoring strategies to do so. But that's still incredibly important, but I thought today we'd use a more timely example in our limited time of how data can help us focus our efforts to intervene. This work by the DePaul Institute for Housing Studies shows a map of neighborhoods in Chicago where the darkest shades represent the greatest share of renter households working in vulnerable industries. Read there as susceptible to COVID-related layoffs. They're also housing cost burdened, which means they pay more than 30% of their income to rent. Look, data like this and all kinds of market data and other data can help us focus our efforts and also predict where we need to invest our resources and to monitor things like evictions and increases in vacancy and issues of deferred maintenance. Strategic code enforcement also means we have to understand that we are part of a coordinated approach. Communicate, communicate, communicate. What code enforcement does is a part of a cycle of property. And while today it may be most important to focus as much efforts, and probably in any day, focus as much effort as we can into preventing property from going to decline, we have to understand that we'll need the tools in place for acquisition, for maintenance, and then to get them back to get properties back to productive reuse. This whole thing has to be driven by the community, by property and market data, but we also have to understand at each phase of this who our partners are and connect with them, form a task force, set up monthly meetings, understand who has resources to be able to connect property owners that want to comply. The code enforcement can connect property owners who want to comply with those resources to help them fix it up, or property tax relief programs to give them a little bit more of a cushion to be able to invest in maintenance and other issues. To know who your partners are, communicate with them, and set up meaningful ways to do that. So what can we do with all of that information, right? Once we know a lot about what the situation is, what our neighborhoods look like, what our markets are, we know a little bit more about our partners and our tools, we can start to assess which tools are most effective, are in which neighborhoods, what the likely outcomes will be, and who the key partners are that we need to work with to do that. Look, this is going to look different everywhere. I want to stress that this example is for vacant buildings with an absentee owner. It's going to look a lot different when you're talking about a substandard rental property with an owner who's just simply not listening, right? So the point is, once you know what you know, you can think through things like this. For example, we've found that issuing a bunch of tickets with fines for debris and minor exterior matters in weak market neighborhoods doesn't often result in compliance, and very few fines actually get paid to help support additional code enforcement efforts. So it's likely that a code enforcement group may decide to focus strategic demolition or nuisance abatement in those neighborhoods where appropriate and avoid spending the resources issuing a bunch of tickets that likely won't move the needle all that much. So what are some of the main components of strategic enforcement, and what do we mean by this? Number one, got to be able to diagnose the problem, improving data collection and management, and understanding the factors keeping properties stuck. Is it the laws, the lien priority? Is it the markets? Is it the ownership? Are the costs of that property impacting the neighborhood negatively? What's keeping it stuck? Use this information to inform what are your top priorities. Are they vacant and dilapidated structures that have public liens that exceed the value of the property and are just stuck? Is there an abandoned neighborhood grocery store or something putting stress on neighborhoods and attracting less than desirable activity? Is it substandard rental properties? Perhaps people just simply need a gathering place that enhances the fabric and culture of the community. At the end of the day, we have to diagnose what the problem is. And then we can diagnose, or we can set up proactive data-driven interventions tailored to market conditions and community goals. Understanding markets is key, and it's going to be even more so given unpredictability and the potential for volatility in the future. You need to develop strategies that reflect these different neighborhood conditions and make sure that you only push the market so far as it can tolerate. And this is going to be one of the key things I want to stress today. Heavy-handed enforcement may work to resolve certain issues of vacancy and neglect by absentee property owners with the means to comply, but who are unwilling to do so, especially when the property is in a stable or emerging market. But that kind of an approach could be the straw that breaks the camel's back when executed on a financially strapped homeowner or landlord in a distressed housing market who is just one code enforcement fine away from being upside down and abandoning his property. We have to know the difference. We have to pay attention to that in this type of world, and we have to apply the tools that we have strategically. Thoughtfully allocate limited resources. I think we've spent some time on that. Build the toolbox. We need a suite of programs, laws, and tools. They have to be flexible to accommodate and protect vulnerable property owners who want to comply. It's really important to identify those tools you have and those you need to be successful. Now is a good time, in my opinion, to create a toolbox. This can be a really simple exercise. We worked with the city of Waterbury, Connecticut, and the city attorney's office developed just a simple Excel spreadsheet listing all of the legal tools available to the city to address and compel the transfer of vacant properties, including timelines, costs, and likely outcomes. This was an immensely helpful sheet and simply gave folks an idea of where to go to understand how these tools worked and in which situations they'd be most appropriate. Coordinating across silos, and I'll move to the next slide and talk about build cross-sector partnerships. We have to share information. We have to work together with folks both within local government, and when I say we, and I've been saying that a lot, I do mean code enforcement. We have to work within local government. We have to work across departments, and we have to work with cross-sector partners as well. We need to be able to share information and share data. We have to bring all of those departments that touch on the issues of neighborhood revitalization to the table to devise cross-departmental approaches. And we need to invest in broader efforts to address housing security and the health and safety of people and places, including nonprofit community development institutions, local financial institutions, public health agencies, affordable housing developers. All of these folks we need to have partnerships with, and we need to work for and share data with to get to our goals. Code enforcement officers with excellent interpersonal and problem-solving skills. This is key, and especially now. There are going to be a lot of issues where folks simply can't repair now, and the skill set of being able to interact and help people to solve problems, to direct them to resources, is going to be one that's going to be immensely valuable. The process must be efficient and effective, and outcomes should be equitable. We talked about that on the earlier slide, and I'll point again to our Mobile report listed at the end of this webinar. Maintain or build capacity. This is a tough one today, particularly given the constraints on local governments, but we need to be honest. Investing in equitable strategies, being proactive, focusing resources where needed most, those will help to become more efficient in how we do it. But even before COVID hit, many code enforcement officers were already operating with insufficient staff and were continually expected to do more. I had a conversation with a larger city that's exploring a proactive rental inspection program. It was great. They had a whole lot of great things, but they were also really struggling to add to their code enforcement staff to be able to support that program. And without that extra staff to be able to support something like a proactive rental inspection program, we have to be honest that the lack of capacity could lead very well to unenforced ordinances or violations the inability to put meaningful penalties against the property, and it may invite property owners, the bad property owners, to ignore our property maintenance standards. We have to be careful that we protect as much as we can to have the people in place at every level to equitably, effectively, and efficiently carry out our strategy. And then the last point here, which I think is very critical going forward, is going to be define, measuring, and reporting success. We have to define long-term success. We also have to set short-term and achievable goals based on what we're trying to accomplish. Do some quick and visible wins. Mow a series of vacant lots. Work with a local artist to board up a series of vacant storefronts and make that a more visually appealing experience. Remember that small but visible actions build neighborhood confidence, and confidence is contagious. And then we have to establish performance criteria that measure outcomes, not output. What good does it do to count the number of citations issued if your compliance rate is down to 0 or 10%? We have to think through the kinds of things that really will define and measure success. Are we talking about how many tickets we've issued, or are we talking about now how many folks, how fewer calls we're getting and neighborhoods are looking better? Are we talking about how more people are coming to code enforcement as a resource proactively to try to address some of those issues? So those are some of the key elements of strategic code enforcement that we think are really important. So let's get to the big question. Is code enforcement critical in a COVID-19 world? And I think to answer that question, we need to think through a couple of questions first. One, we don't really know, right? These are a series of best guesses. And I think they're pretty informed, but I think we first understand what's different. We're going to have less money. Okay, there's going to be a lot of owners with less money to pay for maintenance. Tenants will struggle to pay rent, both commercial and residential. Taxes may not get paid. Mortgages may not get paid. And we know this because we can see the unemployment tracking up. And while we know that it's going to be hitting a high at this point, there's also research that was shared with me by my colleague Alan Malik out of the National Bureau of Economic Research that shows that it's not going to get down below 10%, maybe even for quite a long time. It may be late 2021, it may be 2022. So we have to understand that it's not just today, it's going to be over a period of time that we may see this less money to invest in your property. We know the local government will have less money. And the money they do get is already first and foremost being allocated to keeping people housed, whether it's entering into leases to house the homeless in local hotels with the intent to transition into long-term housing or other efforts. We know that that money is going to be tight. We also know that communities are going to experience the impact at different times and in different ways. We'll get to neighborhoods in a minute, but it depends on the way you collect taxes. If a community or local government collects a large percentage of their revenue from rolling sales taxes, they may feel the impact more immediately today, whereas communities that rely more on the property tax may see that happen over time. Pardon me. It is likely that few neighborhoods in urban, suburban, and rural settings alike are going to come out of this crisis completely unscathed. However, the degree to which that impact is felt, just like in the Great Recession and in other disasters and elsewhere, will depend very much on how much money you have, where you live, and in many cases, the color of your skin. We're already seeing African Americans experiencing the health impacts of COVID at a far greater rate, and it will likely be communities of color, including African American, Latinx communities, as well as indigenous communities across the country that experience the economic fallout from this crisis the most. Sadly, as many have said before me, this virus isn't creating new inequities. It's simply exacerbating the ones that we've seen existing for a great deal of time. I want to point out here revisiting this map that the Institute for Housing Studies in DePaul did. This is not an exact science, nor is this intended to be, but I want to just point out, if you look closely at the darker shaded neighborhoods, which, as a reminder, those are the neighborhoods primarily with color in Chicago. They have a higher share of the rent-burdened households working in COVID vulnerable occupations. You can see the overlap in some of those areas in the 1930s map, those red-lined areas in the South and Southwest, where folks were denied mortgages based on the percentage of people of color in those neighborhoods. Look, for decades in this country, communities of color have experienced disinvestment, predatory lending, racist land use. Neighborhoods today are still ravaged by this vacancy, abandonment, deterioration because of this redlining, because of the exclusion of these neighborhoods from accessing capital. And it's no different today. The pandemic is, again, just exacerbating some of those inequalities. Code enforcement needs to be aware of that and to not put the pressure on them, on those neighborhoods through unintended or over-aggressive enforcement. So just a reminder, as we think about what's different, what we know, we have to keep in mind our goal. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve this compliance, and how can we best get there given all these different pressures that we plan on seeing? Look, it's critical. We know code enforcement is critical to invest in efforts to address decline. We know that they impose significant costs on a community, not just in terms of costs to address an increase in government services, but also on the impact these properties have on neighboring property values, lowering the tax base, contributing to diminished neighborhood confidence and morale. When code enforcement is done right, it can have an incredibly valuable impact, and it can impact the neighborhood and make it healthier and safer, attract investment, and increase home values. So we know that it's going to be important. So is it critical? Absolutely. But how we achieve our goals in a world impacted by COVID-19 may look a little different. Beware the unintended consequences and avoid the pressure to use code enforcement to generate revenue to fill budget gaps. Some of the tools we have, ticketing, issuing fines and enforcement, are really easy to use against vulnerable neighborhoods or homeowners who don't have a ton of money or small mom and pop landlords. In my days in Chicago and in speaking with others across the country, it's my experience that finding and assessing fines for relatively minor violations against low-income homeowners wasn't very hard. You could find them. Many times they would show up to hearings. It's the bad ones, the ones that own a number of properties, many vacant and falling apart, dozens of vacant lots with massive dumping issues and overgrowth. These are the ones that can protect themselves from those tools, from individual liability behind LLCs. They hire the attorneys to get out of it and they never comply. And so if we focus on those tools to just issue tickets and fines and things against persons individually, our impact is going to be on those vulnerable neighborhoods. And it's still going to be hard to get those bad actors. And so we need to have the tools that allow us to do that. Look, recognize where the value in code enforcement lies. Don't be a change. The value's in the people, the expertise, the skills, their ability to serve as a touch point between residents and their government. We need to think about in terms of how we can leverage that expertise and skill, and it may look a little bit different. But at the end of the day, we can't abandon what we do well. The first job for code enforcement is compliance, to maintain health and safety in that neighborhood. And we need to be positioned to be able to act and to have those tools available to allow us to do so quickly when that property becomes a real problem. So let's go through some of these practice and policy tips in this section. And as we kind of go forward, what I hope here is there's a number of practice tips, some examples. I may go through some of the examples fairly quickly in the interest of time today so that we can get to your questions and get everybody out of here on time. But I want to be clear that if you have any questions for follow-up or you see something that you think is interesting, this information will be provided to you in another week or so after we're done. And so if you do have any other questions, you can always follow up with us at that time. So first point, local government's efforts to address the impact of the crisis, as we've talked about several times before, need to acknowledge historic inequities, economic realities, and the reality of what COVID is doing first. We have to be intentional about breaking the patterns of unfairness, supporting equitable responsive measurements, and to really focus first on equity. And so here's a quick framework to kind of think through how code enforcement may be able to do that. Build trust. Conduct proactive community sweeps, work with neighborhood associations and block clubs, organize neighborhood beautification days. Show the community that you are there to be seen as a resource, that code enforcement can do this, so that folks will come to you. Be a resource, not an adversary. Make the first step in enforcement education. Make connections to existing resources for homeowners and landlords who want to comply and are in stable and underperforming neighborhood markets to do so. avoid the unintended consequences. I just explained that story, but that aggressive enforcement for those who don't have the means could very well push folks down the road. Leverage our partners like public health agencies, housing counseling organizations, land banks, community land trusts to explore options that might be available to support those current owners. And then finally, consistent outcome-driven enforcement. For those owners who do have the means but are unwilling to address the negative impact imposed on their property by the community, code enforcement should demonstrate the capacity to effectively and efficiently compel compliance or transfer of the property. So we do think we're going to see an issue of deferred maintenance. We talked about less money being out there, and so traditional enforcement may be particularly ineffective to address this. We need easy to read, accessible manuals for owners and tenants. This is a short-term thing that folks can get started on now. We need a list of all the repair and maintenance resources for homeowners and landlords. Again, another short-term thing, but we want to make sure that we have public and private resources on there and directing people to those. Code enforcement officers can either hand those out on sweeps, hand those out to people, or include them with any notice of violation or anything that they send out. Code lien release programs. A lot of cities have this already in place. This, if you don't, it may be more of an immediate term or longer term solution, but work with these. Release code liens if people can show at least some evidence that they're starting to do what they can to comply. Some examples of how we can get out there and actually how cities are already dealing with these kinds of things from a more equitable standpoint. There's the Motor City Makeover, which is an annual citywide volunteer cleanup and beautification initiative. Cleanup efforts are scheduled by districts that go out there. Now, this is an annual thing. A lot of other programs may do it more regularly. This could be something to invest in, to bring tools, bring resources out there, rakes, mowing equipment, things like that to help the community and provide education while doing so. Get creative with how you inform folks about what the property standards are and what they need to do to comply. Fort Myers, Florida has established this Code Man Hero, which is, yes, it's cheesy, but it is a superhero that simply talks about what needs to be done to maintain compliance and how to do it. Whatever connects with folks in your area, I urge you to consider it and to be creative. There are other programs and resources that cities can offer or partner with nonprofit institutions or other neighborhood organizations to do. Battle Creek, Michigan has a free paint program. They provide up to 10 free gallons of paint for folks that simply need to paint the exteriors. There's a porch program in Flint, Michigan, which was started by a resident to simply engage their neighbors, to initiate porch repairs, to plant gardens, to do so, and then to partner with local educational and financial institutions to build support and resources to be able to do that. Philadelphia Land Cares program with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. With support from the city, the Horticultural Society partners with contractors and community groups, and they can turn vacant lots into positive public green vacant spaces. They have lasting benefits, and there have been studies on this that show decreased gun violence and improved mental health. We need to make sure that we continue to look at and understand what we are able to invest post-COVID in public and nonprofit home repair programs, grants, or loans. A couple of entities that are Rebuilding Together and Habitat for Humanity affiliates across the country who are working hard to put some of these things into place or are trying to grow their programs that already exist. I urge you to check those out. Landlords. There are some, but very few, rehab loans for landlords. Some that we've found exist in Milwaukee and the small landlord loan program in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but these are hard to find, hard to come by. And that segues us into the next issue that we think we're going to see a lot of, which is rent, the rental housing stock. Nearly 43 million people rent in the United States as of 2017. 2/3 of the people below the poverty line are renters, and 1/3 of all rentals are single family. And what does this mean? It means that a lot of people who rent are vulnerable. It means that it's not just these big multi-unit apartment buildings, but that it's single family properties across the country. And the programs right now to support people and help them to pay the rent are getting eaten up real fast. There is an article here that shows United Way in Kings County, Washington, with support from the city, had their $5 million fund dried up in 48 hours and received 7,000 applications for only 2,000. Chicago offered $2 million to help 2,000 people pay their rent and got 83,000 applications in 5 days. Moreover, if people can't pay the rent, responsible landlords need help as well. And there's very little out there to do so, as I mentioned previously. So what can we do about it? How can we rethink? How can code enforcement reach out and be a resource here? We can use our contacts to reach out to the rental community, to learn what they're experiencing, to serve as a point of contact when issues arise between landlords and tenants, either because of the required inspections or maintenance issues of the parties. We should be thinking about how to leverage those interactions to address those challenges, to prevent evictions, and proactively communicate these strategies with tenants and landlords, helping them understand both what the market will bear if there is an eviction, what might be required if the unit becomes vacant, what the costs might be. At this point, also, we want to point out that there's voluntary registration. We will still want to know who's out there. We want to get registration programs. Rental registration programs can be very helpful to understand who owns the properties, where the problems are. At this point, we need to find ways to incentivize participation to build some of those programs. It's not an easy lift, but it's something that could be really important. And so we can explore some of those tools. Work with good, responsible local landlords to explore repair grant and low interest loan programs. Ask those partners to help build you some of those programs or to connect with some of the financial institutions that you may be able to leverage to build resources to be able to build some of these programs. And be proactive. Complaint-driven enforcement on its own does little to raise the overall quality of rental housing and can be abused. Consider adopting a performance-based proactive rental inspection and or licensing program. Now, this is a long-term tip, and it's something that may be something that your community can explore, but is also going to take some time. Those cities and areas that do have these programs already have a network to connect with their to connect with their tenants, to connect with their landlords, and to be able to help devise solutions. But when you are dealing with rental properties, there's a couple of things to remember. One, good landlords are a key partner in creating and establishing any of these systems. The primary goal of regulation is not to drive them out of business, but to set standards and to raise the housing quality bar. As my colleague Alan Malik likes to say, landlords are not the problem, bad landlords are the problem. And for every approach, we have to commit to equity. For everything we do to regulate rental property, we need to understand, will it result in involuntary displacement? And do we need relocation assistance programs? Will retaliatory evictions rise? And do we have the connections with legal aid? Do we have right to counsel laws or anti-retaliation laws or ordinances? And how will our success in building up safer, healthier neighborhoods impact affordability? And are we connected to affordable housing programs or plans? Some examples to kind of look at right now and how to figure out how to help and support the condition of the rental housing stock. Pennsylvania, the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, has established a landlord toolkit. This toolkit includes a template of a letter to be sent to tenants discussing ways the landlords are reacting to COVID-19, the pandemic, and your process to work with them. This landlord toolkit includes a template of a rental repayment plan that could be used for landlords to help tenants create an agreement to how to pay rental arrearages, a series of fact sheets on the recent moratorium for evictions and utility shutoffs, and general resources for both landlords and tenants. Again, just getting the message out there, education, working with your landlords, using that information then to help design programs and reactions. There are more robust rental registration, inspection, and licensing programs, and a couple of the ones that we've spent some time learning about in the past years from Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center. There's also different ways of looking at it, where it's proactive rental inspection programs, really emphasizing healthy housing. In Rochester, New York, they've had great success with reducing the presence of lead in an aging housing stock with their program. And finally, something else that Minneapolis is doing is a tenant navigator program in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This tenant navigator program is something that has city employees working directly with tenants to help them understand challenges and issues when the building is going to be an issue, to help connect them to resources throughout the county, both public and private, and is a really excellent tool. One issue that we're not going to touch on a great deal is that safety is key. Most cities are not conducting interior inspections except for serious health threats right now. Although we don't cover it here, protecting the health and safety of tenants and inspectors is critical. Obviously, that will require a whole lot of things, including access to PPE, other things like that. Some of the things we're hearing about, some partners are exploring parameters related to whether and how to conduct virtual inspections using video conferencing. The partners in the city of Memphis and Neighborhood Preservation Inc. in Memphis are exploring the use of 360-degree cameras to drive around neighborhoods and identify potential areas for follow-up. The testing they've done so far has helped at-risk or elderly neighborhood and block leaders who aren't able to leave their homes take a quick survey of what's happening in their neighborhoods. So interesting, safety is key, but it's interesting to track this. Finally, vacancy and abandonment. We do expect that we'll see an increase in vacancy and abandonment. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly through this. Assess and track the available data to understand where we're going to see these vacant and abandoned properties. Know your tools. Understand the authority to compel the transfer through delinquent tax enforcement or code lien foreclosure. Explore or bolster your vacant property registration ordinance. This is something that a lot of communities have. If you look at safeguard properties, they have a listing of a whole lot of cities and what those might look like. And finally, consider creating a land bank or a land banking program or some entity to be able to handle or responsibly manage and see the transfer of vacant and abandoned property that may become tax delinquent or problematic. Explore state enabling legislation. The most effective land banks are going to be those land banks that are created pursuant to effective state enabling legislation. So examples to consider, look at a third-party data provider. There's some excellent ones out there. Here's just a few. Spend some time assessing your tools. If you have problems with vacancy and abandonment, be ready, employees, to do focused strategic demolitions so you know that the demolitions you have are going to have the greatest impact on that neighborhood. If you can't do it already, explore something like the judicial in rem code enforcement. I referenced our work in Mobile, Alabama. This is a new tool to foreclose on code liens in a judicial in rem process, and that foreclosure would result in clear and marketable title at the back end. Again, I urge you to consider reading more in the report that we've done on this. And then finally, consider land bank models. We have a wealth of resources on land bank models, and in fact, my colleagues Kim and Tarek will be talking about land banks in our next webinar in 2 weeks. So at the end of the day, there's a challenge to the field. We do have an opportunity now to rethink code enforcement, to leverage the talent, the expertise, the resources, and the tools that exist to become a true accomplice in building more equitable, resilient communities of opportunity. Today is a day to focus on equity and moving forward. And I think that that'll be, code enforcement can play an integral role in this. I want to thank all of you for listening, and I'm going to put you all on mute for a moment while I take a look at some questions and use just a few of these minutes to address those. All right, I'm back, and thank you for your patience here. I have a lot of questions here about whether or not there will be any of this information available later. Yes, absolutely. We will be sending the presentation and other links out to folks. I just want to answer a couple of questions. Can you give some examples of a complaint-based code enforcement programs, and how does a systematic rental inspection program curb the abuse of a complaint-based code enforcement program? I do want to touch on that briefly because I think it's important to understand that the abuse of a complaint-based code enforcement program is more based on the risk that the issues won't necessarily be tracked. Systematic rental inspection programs mean that with regular routine inspection, that there's a greater likelihood that will improve the housing stock that exists. Complaint-based code enforcement, historically, we've seen that a lot of tenants will not report issues for fear of retribution or reaction. If it's a more proactive program where the government is taking the lead on heading into the thing, sometimes, and there are protections in place to protect those tenants, that systematic rental inspection can be much more effective in raising the standard and incentivizing landlords to improve proactively some of those things. I also noticed that the city of one of the notes here, the city of Indianapolis has a great landlord registry that's very helpful in locating landlords. Just wanted to highlight that as a potential option for folks to consider and to check out. Let's see here. Let me see here, and I apologize. I am trying to look at a little tiny question box. You said to avoid unintended consequences where aggressive enforcement won't help, to suggest that the property be placed in a land trust, and how will this help, and what if you don't have a land trust? And I'm sorry if I suggested that. I don't know if that's necessarily the best result for that to be the case. What I was talking about, where you're talking about avoiding aggressive unenforcement, and I brought up the land trust as a potential opportunity, where you have a landlord or a homeowner who perhaps is struggling to keep up with the payments and the repairs that need to be made. It may be that a more affordable option to explore, or a more supportive system to explore, would be whether or not a community land trust might have some impact on, for example, keeping that property, their ability to keep that property, or to enter into, or to sort of help with, depends on whether or not maybe it'll reduce the tax bill a little bit, something like that. Could also help them keep the property and move it forward to become a little bit more affordable. That may be a solution in the right market and where there is a land trust. And if you don't have a land trust, you don't have an ability to separate the land to have a long-term ground lease to create affordability, that might not be the appropriate solution. I'm happy to have a conversation about that with a follow-up. I have another question here: how to address liability concerns by elected officials over creation and implementation of a core of neighborhood volunteers to help the individual or elderly incorporated. I would want to know exactly what those liability concerns might be, but I would first start with the question of risk. In fact, in thinking over exactly what the risk is that they're worried about. I don't think it's a particularly high risk for a local government to work with the neighborhood to go out and help to clean and mow and do things responsibly. So if there are liability concerns, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you to figure out if there's something else that those folks are particularly concerned about. What software has been working well for cities for proactive rental inspections? I don't have a single answer for you. I would say to point you to, at this point, one of the better examples we know of is the city of Minneapolis has done a really great job of doing so. But the software that works really well for those proactive rental inspections will completely depend on exactly what it is you're looking to do. There's a variety of ways a proactive rental inspection program could be built. It could be performance-based, where if you pass a certain inspection, you have a longer period of time to before the government has to come back and inspect the property, as opposed to if you don't pass an inspection, it might be that they come back in 1 to 2 years to do so. Several people have asked if I can share a copy of the sheet mentioned from the city of Waterbury. Certainly we can, if you would like to reach out to me personally, we can connect you with the appropriate folks and see if that's a possibility. And although there are a lot more questions, I'm going to pause here on the questions, and I'm going to point now to a couple of additional resources that I have been referencing throughout the presentation. First of all, a lot of our COVID-19 response resources are right here. I really encourage you all of what I put out today and what we continue to put out and forward, we do collaborate with each other. We as an organization have a great deal of experts in the field, and I encourage you to read some of these other resources and think they'll be incredibly helpful going forward. I also want to talk about some of the more narrow code enforcement resources we have, neighborhoods by numbers, raising the bar, linking landlord incentives and regulation, and then the Mobile report that I mentioned in the past. I think these are going to be really helpful resources for folks interested in some of the things that we talked about, particularly in the strategic code enforcement section of today's webinar. There are also a number of webinars available on our website and other resources and reports talking about code enforcement that both Community Progress and our partners have put together, and I urge you to check those out. I finally want to leave you with land banks, land banking programs, and COVID-19 strategic considerations for a long-term equitable recovery. My colleagues Kim and Tarek will be putting this webinar on June 4th. I want to thank you all so much for attending today. I also want to urge everybody we are here to help you brainstorm and think through new and more impactful approaches to addressing code enforcement. We also know that you, practitioners are in the field, are the ones trying and testing out what works and what doesn't. We want to hear from you. If we can help, fantastic. If we can elevate what you're speaking about and communicate that to a broader audience, we would love to be able to find a way to do so. So I urge you to reach out if you want some help from us, and we can absolutely explore how we can be the most helpful. Thank you so much, and have a great, great rest of the week.
All right. Thank you, Matt, for a great presentation, and thank you to everybody who participated in today's webinar. As Matt mentioned, our next webinar will be on June 4th. That'll be focused on the role land banks and land banking will play in addressing the COVID-19 health crisis. And with that, I will leave you all to have a great afternoon.